They say power reveals a man's true nature, but in the case of Chief Okonkwo of Umueze village, power didn't just reveal his darkness, it became his religion. What I'm about to tell you happened not in the distant past, but in 1987, in a remote village in Anambra State, where tradition had become a weapon and a chief had discovered that the most effective way to rule was through absolute terror. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about traditional authority and the thin line between custom and cruelty. Chief Okonkwo wasn't born evil. That's what makes this story so disturbing. People who knew him as a young man described him as ambitious, yes, but not necessarily cruel. He was the third son of a wealthy palm wine tapper, educated up to Standard 6, which was impressive for his generation. He married 4 wives, fathered 18 children, and built his compound on the highest point in Umueze village. From his veranda, he could see every corner of the village, and eventually that view became a symbol of something far more sinister: his belief that nothing in Umueze should happen without his knowledge or permission. He became chief in 1979 through what the elders called divine selection, though rumors persisted that several of his rivals for the throne had mysteriously died or disappeared in the months leading up to his coronation. But Umueze was a village where people learned early not to ask too many questions. Questions, you see, had a way of leading to consequences. For the first 2 years of his reign, Chief Okonkwo seemed almost benevolent. He settled land disputes with what appeared to be wisdom. He performed the necessary sacrifices to the ancestors, and he spoke at length during village meetings about unity and progress. But those who paid close attention noticed small things: the way he would pause and smile when someone disagreed with him, as if memorizing their face for later; the way people who challenged his decisions in public would become suddenly quiet and cooperative within days; the way certain families would pack their belongings in the dead of night and leave Umueze without saying goodbye to anyone. It was in 1982 that the burials began, though no one called them that at first. A young man named Chukwudi made the mistake of refusing to give up his farmland when the chief wanted to expand his cassava plantation. Chukwudi was stubborn, the kind of stubbornness that comes from being right. The land had belonged to his father and his father's father. He had the documents, witnesses, everything. He even traveled to the local government headquarters to file a complaint. 3 days after he returned from that trip, Chukwudi disappeared. His wife, Adeyezi, ran through the village screaming his name until her voice gave out. A search party was organized. They combed through the forest, checked the river, questioned everyone. Nothing. Chief Okonkwo himself joined the search, his face a mask of concern, promising a reward for any information. 2 weeks later, a hunter found something in a remote part of the forest: freshly disturbed earth in a rectangular shape. When they dug, they found Chukwudi. But here's what made people's blood run cold. He wasn't just buried. He had been buried alive. His fingers were torn and bloody from clawing at the coffin lid. His mouth was frozen in a silent scream. The positioning of his body told a story of absolute terror and desperate, futile struggle. The village was horrified, but Chief Okonkwo controlled the narrative with masterful precision. He declared that Chukwudi must have offended the land spirits, that this was clearly a spiritual matter beyond human understanding. He ordered an elaborate purification ceremony and personally contributed a goat and 3 tubers of yam for the sacrifice. He spoke movingly at the funeral about the mysteries of fate and the importance of respecting the gods. And then, in what seemed like an act of extraordinary generosity, he gave Chukwudi's widow a plot of land to farm, not the disputed land, of course, that now belonged to the chief's cassava plantation. Adayes accepted it in silence, her eyes empty, and never spoke about her husband's death again. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't, because Chief Okonkwo had discovered something intoxicating about that particular method of murder. It wasn't just effective, it sent a message that echoed louder than any public execution could. The image of Chukwudi's clawed fingers and silent scream spread through Umueze like a virus. People stopped sleeping properly. They stopped arguing about injustices. They stopped questioning. 6 months later, a woman named Obi Ageli was accused of stealing from the chief's yam barn. She swore on her children's lives that she was innocent, but the chief had witnesses. His own guards, naturally. Obiageli's body was found 3 weeks after her disappearance, in another shallow grave, with the same terrible evidence of live burial. This time, Chief Okonkwo didn't even pretend it was a spiritual matter. During the next village meeting, he stood before everyone and spoke in a voice that carried no emotion whatsoever. "The gods have shown us how they deal with thieves and troublemakers," he said. "It is not for us to question their methods." No one dared point out that gods don't usually use shovels and coffins. By 1985, Umueze had become a village of whispers and fearful glances. Chief Okonkwo had refined his system. He had a group of young men he called his special guards, orphans and desperate youth he had recruited with promises of protection and food. These boys, some no older than 16, became his instruments. They would identify targets, usually people who had somehow crossed the chief or possessed something he wanted. They would kidnap them in the night, transport them to a prepared site deep in the forest, place them in roughly made wooden coffins, and bury them alive. The chief himself reportedly watched some of these burials, standing at a distance, his face expressionless. But here's what you need to understand about absolute power and absolute cruelty. It doesn't remain static. It grows. It needs to feed on more and more fear to maintain its potency. By 1986, Chief Okonkwo wasn't just burying people who opposed him or possessed things he wanted. He was burying people to make examples, to test his power, to remind everyone who ruled Umueze. A teenager who had laughed too loudly near his compound. A traitor who had allegedly cheated him by 3 naira in the market. An old man who had made the mistake of referring to the good old days before the current chief. The elders of Umueze, the supposed check on chiefly power, had become hollow men. Some had been replaced by the chief's loyalists. Others had been intimidated into silence. A few had tried to resist and had subsequently disappeared. The traditional council meetings became theatrical productions, where everyone affirmed whatever the chief wanted. The village was dying, not from physical depopulation, though many families had fled, but from the death of its spirit. Umueze had become a place where people only spoke in public to praise the chief, where children were taught to report any criticism they overheard, where the absence of opposition wasn't peace, but paralysis born of terror. But there was one person Chief Okonkwo hadn't counted on, a young woman named Amara. Amara was the daughter of one of the chief's victims, a traitor named Mazi Okafor, who had been buried alive in 1984 for refusing to sell his lorry to the chief at a fraction of its value. Amara had been 15 when her father disappeared. She had stood at his funeral, had seen the terrible evidence of his final moments, and had watched her mother die slowly from grief over the next year. Unlike others, something in Amara hadn't broken. Maybe it was her youth, or maybe it was the particular quality of her rage, but she had spent the past 3 years doing something dangerous, remembering. She kept a secret notebook where she recorded every disappearance, every suspicious death, every pattern. She talked to the widows and orphans left behind, collecting their stories, building a case that existed nowhere officially, but everywhere in the collective, traumatized memory of Umueze. In early 1987, Amara made contact with a journalist in Enugu named Chidi Okoro. Chidi worked for a small independent newspaper that had a reputation for taking on stories others wouldn't touch. Getting the information to him required extraordinary courage. Amara couldn't just walk out of Umueze with her notebook. The chief's guards monitored all movement in and out of the village. Instead, she gave her documentation to a pepper trader who traveled to Enugu weekly, hiding the pages inside hollowed-out peppers in her basket. Chidi Okoro received that notebook in March 1987, and what he read shook him. This wasn't just a story about a corrupt chief. It was a documentation of systematic terror, of a man who had created a private kingdom of horror in the supposed democratic Nigeria of the 1980s. But Chidi was also a careful journalist. He knew that accusations against a traditional ruler required more than one person's documentation, no matter how detailed. So he began to investigate. He traveled to Umueze under the pretense of researching traditional governance systems. He interviewed people carefully, reading between the lines of what they said and what they were too afraid to say. He visited the local government offices and discovered that multiple complaints about Chief Okonkwo had been filed and mysteriously disappeared. He talked to police officers who admitted, off the record, that they had been warned not to interfere in Umueze's traditional matters. What Chidi discovered was that Chief Okonkwo's reign of terror had been enabled by a perfect storm of corruption, indifference, and the post-Civil War reluctance to interfere with traditional authority. Local government officials had been bribed, police commanders had been intimidated, and the broader society had simply not wanted to believe that such things could happen in modern Nigeria. In June 1987, Chidi published his exposé. The headline read, "The Burial Chief: How One Man Turned Traditional Authority into a Death Cult." The article was explosive. It documented at least 17 confirmed cases of live burial, with dozens more disappearances that likely followed the same pattern. It included testimonies from escaped victims. Yes, there were a few who had been rescued by sympathetic guards who couldn't stomach what they'd been ordered to do. It exposed the network of complicity that had allowed this horror to continue for 8 years. The response was immediate and overwhelming. National newspapers picked up the story. Human rights organizations demanded investigations. The military governor of Anambra State, embarrassed by the international attention, had no choice but to act. On July 12, 1987, a combined force of police and military personnel surrounded Chief Okonkwo's compound in Umueze. The chief, who had ruled through terror for so long that he had become convinced of his own invincibility, tried to invoke traditional immunity. He stood on his veranda in his full ceremonial regalia and declared that no one could arrest a sacred chief. He was wrong. They took him into custody along with 12 of his guards. The search of his compound and the surrounding forest revealed horror upon horror. They found the burial sites, more than 20 of them. They found the rough coffins, stored and ready for use. They found records the chief had kept, because like many tyrants, he had become proud of his deeds and wanted to remember them. They found photographs. Yes, photographs. Chief Okonkwo had documented some of his burials like trophies. The trial began in October 1987 and lasted 6 months. It was one of the most sensational trials in Nigerian legal history. Chief Okonkwo showed no remorse. He testified that as a traditional ruler, he had the right to punish those who disrespected his authority. He claimed he was upholding ancient customs, though historians testified that no such customs had ever existed in Igbo tradition. He was essentially a man who had created his own reality and couldn't comprehend why others didn't accept it. In April 1988, Chief Okonkwo was convicted on 17 counts of murder. He was sentenced to death by hanging. But here's where the story takes a turn that speaks to the complicated nature of justice in Nigeria. Chief Okonkwo's execution was repeatedly postponed due to various legal appeals and procedural complications. He remained on death row for years until his death from natural causes in 1996. He never faced the executioner. He never experienced anything close to the terror he had inflicted on his victims. Umueze village began the slow process of healing, but recovery from that kind of trauma doesn't happen quickly or completely. Many families never returned. The village elders had to completely reconstitute their traditional council. A memorial was erected for the victims, and every year on July 12th, the anniversary of the chief's arrest, Umueze holds a ceremony of remembrance. Amara, the young woman whose courage helped expose Chief Okonkwo, became a human rights activist. She dedicated her life to working with communities terrorized by authority figures, teaching people that traditional authority must be balanced with accountability, that culture and custom can never justify cruelty. The story of Chief Okonkwo and his burial ground is a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious villainy. Sometimes it wraps itself in the robes of tradition and speaks in the language of authority. Sometimes the most dangerous tyrants are those who convince a community that resistance is impossible, that horror is normal, that silence is survival. Power, unchecked and unaccountable, will always tend toward cruelty. The only thing that stands between civilization and barbarism is the courage of people who refuse to accept that might makes right. People who document the truth. People who speak when speaking could cost everything. Umueze's nightmare lasted 8 years because good people were too afraid to act. It ended because one young woman decided that bearing witness was more important than survival. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the nature of power and the importance of accountability, hit that subscribe button. These stories need to be told and remembered because the moment we forget the lessons of the past is the moment we risk repeating them.